Now, last evening, did I remind you about a few things that you may have forgotten since the last workshop you attended? And did you start to see that future possibilities cannot exist when you're connected to past emotions? Did you understand that? And if you understand that the cycle of thinking and feeling that we create on a daily basis, either from our own auto-suggestions or from our responses to the external world, as we begin to process information from the life that's so familiar to us, the known people and the places that we can predict and the things that we can do, if we wake up in the morning and we allow the environment, our external reality, to control our very thoughts and feelings, then as we think and feel equal to the environment, we're creating more of the same. And it only takes a few days of going unconscious in that way, and like an automatic program, we return back to the old self. So to change then is to think greater than your environment, to think greater than the conditions in your life. And that process means that you literally can change your brain and your body to look like the experience has happened ahead of the actual experience. And when your brain and body are changed because you wake up in the morning and you remember a future that exists as a potential in the quantum field, and you radiate a new electromagnetic signature that matches this signature, well, now you're on a whole new timeline. And you're literally enacting the quantum reality. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It could be as simple as deciding to no longer be afraid, to surrender that and just give it up and go on in spite of it. And as you do that, then you make a different choice, and that different choice literally leads you to a potential that's always existed just by you making a different choice in your future. How many people understand that? So then if you keep thinking the same thoughts and you keep performing the same actions and you keep romancing the same emotions and expecting something different to happen in your life, you are not living by the quantum law. You're living by the old paradigm of religion that was created by a bunch of insecure men that were trying to control people. That's not the quantum model. So when you begin to just decide to think differently, to experiment by keeping your energy up the entire day and not letting those limited emotions make their way back into the subconscious that begins to drive you. You're Gandalf on the bridge saying, you may not pass today. You are in control, and it's that process of weeding out our limitations and beginning to break down those habituations that we really think that is part of who we are. When we begin to make those changes within us, and energy begins to break out of our seams because we're no longer contracted in that pattern, that simple change is the available energy that is now in your field, and you use that energy to literally construct a new destiny, because particles are alive and they respond to your observation. So if you're waking up in the morning then, and you're predicting what your day is going to be like, and you begin to think about all the people you're going to see and all the things you're going to do and all the things that you already know in the predictable life that you live, you're living this familiar future. Would you agree? You're living equal to your environment, and your past self is creating your present self, and it's creating your future self. How many people understand that? Would you also understand that every time you go back and you revisit an emotion, you're back into your past? Emotions are a memory of the past, yes? And then if you romance that and you think and feel in that realm, and that cycle of thinking and feeling creates an electromagnetic field that you're broadcasting, now you're literally creating this future. And then if you're in this future, then here you go again, romancing this past. And what do we keep doing? We're on a very specific line of time that is projecting you to your genetic destiny. And then you could say, I am this way because of this experience that's happened to me back here. And I memorized the emotion because I didn't know that every time I thought about that experience, I was producing the same chemistry in my brain and my body as if the experience was happening. And my body, as the unconscious mind, didn't know the difference between the actual event or the emotion that I was fabricating, because emotions are the language of the body. Thoughts are the language of the brain. So then, if you believe that, then you would say, when a person says, I am this way because of this experience that's happened to me 20 years ago, what they're really saying is, I've memorized this emotion and I don't know how to change. And the only way that I can explain how I am is I could only relate it back to this past event. How many people are still with me? So it goes something like a thought that's connected to a memory that produces an emotion. And then the thought of the memory becomes the emotion, and then we just memorize the emotion. And we live that way. And it's that fracturing of the personality that begins to cause us to disseminate our power in our life. To begin to integrate self again by making choices to be differently. To break the habit of the old self and literally begin to contemplate and speculate possibilities for you. As you're beginning to think about a new possibility in your life, the moment you begin to think about it, you're forcing your brain to fire in new sequences and new patterns and new combinations. And that very process of contemplation, of speculation, of invention, is the building process of the circuitry in your brain, which becomes the platform of who you're going to become. You're sending a signal out in that process of possibility. And as you begin to think about possibility, you're literally drawing your conscious awareness to one of these potentials that only exist in the now moment. They can't exist in the future because as you begin to think about all the things you're going to do in your day, your body's already in the future. But it's in the future, familiar future that you already know. And that known future creates more of the same. How many people are still with me? So then, by the same means, then, a person who's embracing a past event, over time, they forget the event and they just live by that emotion, and then they define themselves as guilty or insecure or afraid or having anxiety or whatever it is for the person. So then, how much of our life do we really live in the present moment? And only in the present moment do you make contact with all these potentials. So if you were to decide then, as you begin to speculate possibilities in your life and you're making a new mind, if you could just surrender the smallest bit to how it would feel from an emotional standpoint, let go and play. Unclutter your energy enough to begin to be like a child and begin to feel what that event would feel like. We're going to do that today because we're going to signal your body over and over again to recondition it to believe that it's in the event. So that when you get up and memorize that state, you have available energy that you're drawing to you. So then, if you were able to play like that enough, and you understand that feelings and emotions are the end product of experience, then you could literally teach your body or instruct it to be ahead of the experience just by you deciding that you don't need a reason in your external world to feel joy, to feel gratitude, to feel possibility, to feel inspired. And then some people would say, well, I really can't do that. I can't feel. And I would say to them, the only reason you can't feel is because you're too memorized into an emotion that's defined you as an identity, as a somebody. The process of creation requires you becoming a nobody. Because the moment you forget about you, there's a physiological change that takes place in the brain, where finally the hindbrain, with all of its survival, stressful emotions, is turned off, and the forebrain is looking at all those possibilities and potentials, because the emotions that are created from the forebrain are joy, and you begin to see a new landscape, a new horizon. You can't do it from the old self, though, because the old self is connected to those old emotions. So if you understand even the smallest bit about this, then you would say then the only person that I'm actually affecting by living by these emotions is me. The judgment that I have and the emotions or the hatred that I live by, or the guilt or the fear, those emotions are signaling the same gene in the same way. And my body thinks it's in a very, very stressful situation in my life. And it could be fine, but your body becomes conditioned so well that it memorizes it better than the conscious mind. Now we're in trouble, because then the only solution for that is to take medication to sedate the body or stimulate the body. The only solution is to go shopping and spend a lot of money so the feeling goes away, or to gamble, or to get on a computer and play games just so that you don't have to feel. But if you pay attention to that feeling and you realize that you've trained your body, the animal, to anticipate so much in the future that it's racing to it, or you begin to realize that you've reviewed your life so many times in analysis that you produce the same emotions that create hopelessness and powerlessness for the body. That's what our life has become. So we have to find something outside of us to make those feelings go away. At the end of our life, we realize then that none of that meant anything. When you sit down and you say, there's got to be something else, and all of the resources that are available are right within me. Because there's a part of us that knows better all the time. Do you know what I mean? We know better all the time. And that voice gets softer and softer as we get older, because we become more distracted by the external world. And we start to rationalize with that conscience that says, you better change, you better take care of this. And then you go on in spite of it, or we go on in spite of it. Until what happens? There's disease, there's loss, there's breakdown in your life. And then when you reach the point where the personality, the identity is so beaten down by its external world that you can't go on business as usual. And that's when people have the catharsis of personal change. They reach their lowest denominator, and then they say, I can't fake it any longer. I can't live like this any longer. I got to do something. And so if we live by these limited emotions that push the genetic buttons that create disease, and you understand that just even from a theoretical standpoint, would you like to wait for your life heads for that genetic potential, or can you choose yourself every morning, like a work in progress, like a work of art, to experiment with life and raise your energy and maintain it, independent of the environment? And if you're so bold enough to do that, to maintain it, something should show up differently in your world. That's the law. And it should come in a way that blows your doors off, that leaves you surprised. I forgot I was in Canada. Jeez. I was in New York, what was it, 2 weeks ago? I was in New York 2 weeks ago, and the audience, and I start talking 2 minutes, and someone's like, hey, blah, blah. I started answering the lady's question, then I started talking, and the lady, finally I said, oh God, I'm in New York, I forgot. Shut up. Okay, anyway. So when you begin to live by that laxity and by that freedom, and you begin, listen, think about this. Where's my person? You. When you live in a state of trust, that you believe in a future that you can't see or experience with your senses, but it's alive in your mind and body, and you have the chills running up your spine because you're excited, but you don't know how it's going to happen or why, but you're living in that state. When you believe in that future that you can't see or experience yet, you've conditioned yourself to be in. You literally are trusting in an outcome. Would you agree? And as you begin to trust in an outcome, and you knew, listen, if you knew your life was going to be handled, would you allow yourself to be caught up in the insignificant emotions and details that so many people become distracted by, so that it stops their growth, it stops their movement in their life, because they bump up against something that causes this big emotional reaction, and then for the rest of the day, they're living in the mood of that experience. And it's that mood then that keeps the events in their life at arm's distance the whole entire time. How many people are with me? So, when you live in these stressful chemicals that endorse the ego to become selfish, self-involved and self-centered and self-indulgent, those stressful emotions create those limited human states of aggression and fear, pain and sadness, and all the things that are blended in between those. That when you live in that state, there's a sense of separateness from possibility. How many people have experienced that? It's called being human, right? And there's literally a contraction of energy that takes place that does not emulate the universal principle of expansion. But when you live in the state of joy or inspiration or enthusiasm, in theos, in God, in a state of godliness, you begin to feel what? Connected, trusting. You see possibilities that you never saw before. You're not sweating the details. You're not thinking about the hows. You just know it's going to work, and you're just going to keep going, and it's going to come to you as a result of who you're being. How many people have had that zone flow experience? People around you are asking you insignificant questions, and you're laughing because those questions don't matter. It only matters to the analytical mind who can't latch on to the dream. Am I making sense? So think about it. Look, think about great people in history. Martin Luther King, William Wallace, Mahatma Gandhi, Joan of Arc. They were all saying, look, I got this huge idea. And you guys can't see it or experience it yet, but it's alive in my mind. It's so alive in my mind, I got to begin to live as if it's already happening. And I don't care what happens to my body. I don't care how long it takes. I don't even care how I feel. It's not important. Those things are insignificant because the dream is much bigger. Now, there's a great possibility that Martin Luther King's brain and Mahatma Gandhi's brain were changed ahead of the actual experience of freedom and justice. They were already in the future. They were ahead of their time. Can you be ahead of your time? Can you latch on to a vision of an ideal of yourself where you go into a laboratory of the mind every morning or every evening and remind yourself who that person is? And if you say, well, I'm going to get up and, I feel all right. I did all right. What is the signal the body's getting? He's all right. But what if you said, I'm not getting up until I'm on fire? Now you may say to me, well, that sounds a little bit too much, Joe. But what if you were on fire with life? What if you were on fire, not like a fanatic, but someone who is embodying knowledge? When it's made its way. Remember we talked about those pathways last night? That the pathways for pain and suffering, the pathways for food and pleasure, the pathways for sex, the pathways for aggression, all those pathways are open. You can have a thought and begin to focus on that thought, and your body's going to respond with any of those things. Yes? But the pathways are there for possibility that has to do with wealth or joy or freedom or whatever it is that you want in your life. But the pathways aren't activated because we're thinking backwards. Which means we need evidence first to feel certain ways. That's not quantum. That's Newtonian. That's living in a linear flow of cause and effect where you evolve, but, it takes a couple million years or more to overcome one thing. But we got this magnanimous forebrain that says that we can use this piece of hardware to begin to observe who we're being. We can pay attention and notice when we're unconscious. We can become aware of our unconscious attitudes, our unconscious beliefs, our unconscious emotions that we think are so normal. And we can become conscious of them so that we can modify our behaviors to do a better job in life. That's called plasticity. Now, because that part of our brain is 40% of our entire brain, it's the workshop where it can look out over the landscape of the brain. And everything you've learned and everything you've experienced, they're sitting as neurological networks in your brain. And the frontal lobe, like a symphony leader, can begin to look out over the landscape of the brain and begin to call up different circuits and then seamlessly piece them together to create a new abstraction, a new idea, a new possibility. That's how fast your brain works when it begins to invent. So the sum of the parts is greater than the whole in the brain. But if you're living your life relying on something outside of you to make you feel and make you think, turning on the TV so you can get an emotion going, doing something to make you feel differently, and you're not at the core driving those things independent of your environment, you're going to live at the effect of the environment. How many people understand? So then, would you agree then that as you wake up in the morning and you remember yourself as the old identity, and you begin to think within that realm of a somebody, that the thinking and feeling creates an electromagnetic field here? That's literally the electromagnetic field of this future that you already know in linear time. Did you guys not get that? Your thinking and feeling creating an electromagnetic field. Remember last night we said the thought is the electrical charge in the quantum field, and the feeling is the magnetic charge, and how you think and feel is the electromagnetic field that you broadcast. That electromagnetic field that you broadcast all the time always connects with the future potential in the quantum field. But the future potentials that you're after only exist in the now moment. The future potential of your anticipated, expected, familiar life is here in linear time. And now you're mapping or matching that linear time state. Does that make sense? In other words, if you don't change something about yourself, you're already predestined to a very specific outcome. Yes? You change then your state. Here's you in the now. Somebody in the now. This is linear time. This is your future predictable familiar life. And if you're creating an electromagnetic field of your familiar memory of self, you're going to live and create the exact same future self. Does that make sense? And the subconscious mind or the quantum field responds to who you're being. So here's all the other future potentials that are existing simultaneously on a different line of time that's still heading to a future. You with me? So you romance the past. That's a known emotion. That's familiar. As you romance the past, you literally move your body back into the past. Do you understand that? Your body thinks it's in a past event. And that emotion then causes you to think and feel a certain way, which creates both your present self and that future self. Yes? You live in linear time. You begin to anticipate a future event. You begin to think and feel a certain way in a predictable life. As you do that, the moment you do that, you're hooking up to this future possibility, this line of time. This is only one line of time, but this is the one that we keep choosing. Drop your fear, let go, and create, and next thing you know, you're on a whole new line of time. New boyfriend, you're contributing to the community, you're making a difference. This is still you, but now you're here. And that person that still is holding on to fear is still living in a potential reality, except You're no longer there. Your awareness is in this one now. But it still exists. That's the many worlds theory in quantum physics. I got some people frowning now. Now, the moment you try to control how it's going to happen, the moment you try to control the outcome, you're back to the old self in the predictable world. Do you understand that? Which means then you have to be in such a state of mind where you are in a state where that information is making it down to a cellular level, that you begin to sense that the event is coming because you begin to develop this concrete certainty called knowingness. Do you know what I'm talking about? And so when you begin to know that you know because your brain and body have changed, that's when you don't have to worry about how it's going to happen. The quantum model says it's always going to be outside of your realm of understanding. Why does it have to be outside your realm of understanding? To change your mind, to literally keep you enthralled about life and evolve your understandings, evolve your knowledge base. Okay, I'll give you an example. A few years back, I was very interested in interdimensional realities, interdimensional everything. So it was a summer evening, and I couldn't sleep. And my daughter came upstairs and, laid on top of me, basically. And she was getting close, and it was warm, and I was like, I gotta get out of bed. It was too hot. So I went downstairs, and I laid on the couch, and I began to think about everything I learned about interdimensional experiences. And I thought, I'm gonna let my body fall asleep, but I'm gonna keep my mind awake. I'm just gonna keep doing that. I'm gonna keep practicing it. It was like 3:34 in the morning, perfect time for brain chemistry. The next thing you know, I'm standing next to my body, out of my body. And I look down, and I recognize that that's me, but I didn't say that, because the moment you say that's me, what happens? You're back in there. So I kind of glanced over, noticing that somebody I looked familiar. And I looked down at the couch, and there's something crawling under the seam of the couch. And I walk over with whatever I was walking in, and I look down, and all of a sudden it crawls down to the bottom and sticks his head out, and it's a little mole, little tiny mole. Now, in the Northwest, moles are like what? Gophers on steroids, right? They're just these huge things, and on my land, they're big. So it's a little mole, and I think, oh my God, look at that mole. And all of a sudden he goes back up, and he crawls across, comes down the other side, and look out, he sticks his head out and looks up at me. So I think, I'm gonna catch this guy. So I walk over to the other side of the couch, and I wait again. And it comes out, and I reach down, and I grab it, and it bites my finger. And now it's hanging on my finger, and I'm looking at this mole, and I'm trying to shake it off, and he's got such a grip on my finger, I can't get him off my finger. So I focus on the French doors on the other side of the room, and I start walking with this mole going like this on my finger. I go through the French doors. I'm standing out on my porch, and I fling this mole off my finger, and it lands on the bench on the porch. And then I look at my finger, and I'm thinking, oh, it hurts. And the moment I start feeling pain, I wind up in my body. So I wake up, and I sit up, and I go, what was that? So I look down at my finger, and it's bright red, where the mole bit me. It's bright red, and it's hurting. So I grab a blanket, and I wrap it around me, and I walk over, and I usually like to go out into the garden in the morning. It was summer. And when I open the doors, the French doors, and I stand outside, I have the blanket around me like this, and I'm just kind of looking at the morning, and I look down on the bench, and there's a little dead mole on the bench. Now, Did I create the moment there? Was it a precognitive moment? Was it multiple realities lining up for that moment? When you start to begin to have an experience that's outside the definition of your current understanding, you just made your brain evolve itself. Does that make sense? You have to go back then and to begin to question what you know and weigh it against what you don't know and find the model of understanding that fits. Does that make sense? So that now your current beliefs about where you think reality is, because I walked away understanding that reality is wherever your awareness is. That's it. You begin to upscale your understandings about possibility when they start happening outside the realm of your understanding, and you should want more and more of those. Does that make sense? And as they begin to happen more and more frequently, you begin to get more playful in the realm to be able to see what could happen next. And so you begin to think about, again, if it happened again, what would I do differently? How could I change it? How could I evolve it? How could I, while I'm in the experience, alter the experience even further? So it should always happen outside the predictable. It should always happen outside of your current understanding, because the moment it happens outside your current beliefs, you just broke through a little further. And then you re-understand what reality is. So when I say control the outcome, what I mean is you shouldn't try to figure out how it's going to happen. Remember my example of my daughter, all the things she's created in her life. As a parent, there's a part of me who always wants to say, oh, really? How are you going to do that? But I can't say that to her any longer because she's proved me wrong every time. I always say, okay, you know what to do. She said, I know exactly what to do. So then when she starts moving into that state, there are signals that start to come into her life to let her know that she's onto something, that something's starting to happen. It may not be the first signal or the second signal. It may not be the first experience or the second experience. By the third or fourth experience, things are starting to happen. And all she's doing is she's going back into the quantum world and that implicit, invisible, implicate system, creating an electromagnetic frequency, matching the electromagnetic frequency of a potential that exists. And as her mind moves to that potential, her body's being drawn to it in her life, or the experience is being drawn to her. Does that make sense? So, you may not know how it's going to happen, or you may not know the way in which it's going to happen, but the important element for you to know is that you're connecting to something, and the environment should begin to send you signals. The moment your environment starts to send you signals, it's no longer cause and effect. In other words, it's not the environment that's producing a change in your internal chemistry called an experience, and then you feel an emotion, and you notice that you feel differently, and then you pay attention to what caused that feeling, that person or that experience or that thing. That's cause and effect. This is doing just the opposite. You're changing something inside of you, both in mind and emotion. And then as you begin to change it inside of you and you notice the effect outside of you, now you're causing an effect. And the moment you begin to see that you caused that effect, the empowerment that's created as a result of that usually leaves you stunned. Because you say, I can't believe it. It happened so fast. I can't believe that it worked just like that. I can't believe it was exactly what I was doing. It happened. And it sometimes happens so fast that you say, how could it happen so fast? Well, is there any time in the quantum world? So it could happen instantaneously if you connect. Is that possible? In other words, if you connect with that future perfectly in the now, can the information bleed right down into the present moment? Can it? It could happen that instantaneously. And then you think you're here, but now you're here, living a different life in a whole nother time. Okay? Now, we talked about this chart about brainwaves, and I just want to review it with you because it's important for you to understand that when you're living in high range beta, that thinking mind, that analytical mind, this is low range beta. This is when you're reading a book and you're enjoying it and you know the information. This is mid-range beta. You're taking a test and the information is fairly known to you. So you're moving up, around 16 to 22 cycles per second. Look at high-range beta. It's twice as high as these two levels. And this is when you're in emergency mode. This is when you're stressed out. This is when you're living in panic or you're living in trying to predict an outcome. This is when your analytical mind is at its height, because those stressful chemicals of adrenaline and cortisol, what they do is they cause the analytical mind to get amped up. The analytical mind is running in first gear, and it's always trying to predict the next moment based on the past moment. It's deciding if it's right or wrong or good and bad. It's going back and forth in duality. And so the more we live by these stressful emotions, the faster the analytical mind moves. Does that make sense? But when you're in a creative mode and you're in alpha and your brain waves are a whole lot slower, and children between the ages of 6 and 8 live in this realm, in this state of alpha, you're in the imaginary world where the internal world seems to be just as real as the external. That's why when you see a kid who's playing and they're acting like a rabbit, and you tell them to act like a rabbit and it's 8:30 or 9 in the morning and it's 4 in the afternoon and you're stepping over them in the kitchen and they're still a rabbit, because that internal world is that real to them. They can play in that imaginary world. And most adults fatigue with children when the imaginary world, because kids could stay there for days on end. And you have to be able to enter that world with them, because brain waves are so different. There's a interface between the internal and external world. Does that make sense? In other words, when they're living in alpha, what they're thinking about and what they're imagining is actually being laid over reality in a certain sense. And my daughter she was probably maybe 14 before she left alpha. She was just one of those kids that loved being there. And I'd have to enter her world. And that was a lot of Steiner's work, to keep kids in that state of alpha so that they could stay in that creative space, because the rest of their life they're going to be in beta, and why not extend that imaginary period? So, the whole purpose of meditation then, we talked about this the last time, but I want to review it with you. Let's say this circle represents your mind, and when you're born, you're totally subconscious mind. We know that your totally subconscious mind is because your brain waves between the ages of 0 and 6 are in delta and theta. You're pretty much asleep with your eyes open as an infant. And theta brainwave patterns is that realm where you're in twilight, or when you're half awake and you're half asleep. Delta is when you're, knocked out cold, dead asleep. But imagine a child between the ages of 0 and 2 living in delta, asleep with their eyes open, and then moving into alpha between the ages of 2 and 6, where they're in theta, when they're in that state where their body's half awake and half asleep, and they're in that lucid realm. And so when the mind is developing from the ages of about 0 to 12, 0 to 7 or so, we're in that state of subconscious mind where all the information that's coming in is coming in unedited, because there's no analytical mind to process it. So we begin to learn by these positive and negative identifications and associations. A good example of a positive identification is when you're young and you cry out and you get fed. You learn to associate crying out with being fed, so every time you're hungry, you cry out and you get fed, or you get changed, or you're uncomfortable. It becomes a means of communication, of behavior. Negative association, you put your finger on the hot stove, you learn to associate pain with the stove. So after a couple attempts, you start to notice that your change in your internal chemistry must be connected to something in your external world. So you learn to associate that stove with pain, and you don't do it anymore. And so these positive and negative identifications create what's called habits and behaviors. And so you can say big boys don't cry, women should be seen and not heard. Whatever the program is, literally goes encoded into the subconscious, because the child has no analytical mind to process it in any other way, because their brain waves are in the dream state. How many people are still with me? And this is a lot of Bruce Lipton's work, a dear friend of mine. He talks about this extensively. Now, right around the ages of about 6 to 9, we begin to form what's called the analytical mind, or the critical mind. And the analytical mind acts as a barrier to separate the conscious mind from the subconscious mind. Now, that analytical mind is the mind that you use to criticize, to judge, to evaluate, to analyze pros and cons, goods and bads, rights and wrongs, and all of that stuff. And because the brain is dual, it has two hemispheres, we live kind of in duality. Does that make sense? So, the conscious mind makes about 5% of our total mind. It's made up of things like logic and reasoning, which gives rise to our creative abilities, or desires, or what our will is. But the subconscious mind is made up of 95% of our mind, and it's made up of all these positive and negative identifications and associations that give rise to your habits and your behaviors. So you can understand then the majority of who we are by the time we're 35 years old sits in the subconscious program system, where the person may consciously say, I want to be happy, I want to have a good life, but they have a whole different subconscious agenda. Are you with me? So what is the whole purpose of meditation? Well, this analytical mind is always running. It's always going. People's minds are always wandering to the future, or wandering to the past, or thinking about something good or thinking about something bad, or positive or negative, or all the different dualities that people live by. Well, when we can begin to slow the conscious mind down, or you begin to eliminate your external world, and you close your eyes, and you eliminate the sensory input that's coming from your outside world, the moment you eliminate the visual input and you begin to close off maybe the auditory input by playing music or putting earplugs in or sitting in silence, your brainwaves naturally go from processing the external world to moving into a more of a relaxed state, and that's called alpha. And the moment you start moving into alpha, your brainwaves slow down, and it's not as easy to analyze. It's not as easy to criticize. It's not as easy to think in terms of duality. You still with me? So the whole purpose of meditation then is to enter the subconscious mind by opening the door through the analytical mind. And once we can open the door through the analytical mind and get into the subconscious, then we can begin to change these negative associations to more positive ones. So when we do that process in the beginning, like we did last night in the meditation, where you begin to become aware of the space that your body is in space, and the space around your body in space, and the space that your body occupies in space, and the space, the room in space, the moment you do that, and you participate without analyzing, and you just become aware, an amazing thing happens. You go from a very object-focused, when you're living in stress, in that beta realm, you're obsessing about something. You're obsessing about your problems. You're obsessing about your hairdos. You're obsessing about your clothes or your things in your life or your problems. You're obsessing about something, and you're looping between thinking and feeling. And those chemicals cause us to become very object-focused, because when a lion is sitting in the Serengeti and it's sunbathing, and it sees a gazelle walking in with a group of other gazelles, and it's out of pattern because it's limping, the moment the lion sees the gazelle that's limping, it becomes very object-focused. It says, that's lunch, and that's dinner for my cubs, and I don't see anything else. And the moment the gazelle sees the lion's eyes through the brush, and it notices that there's something that's about ready to chase it, it becomes very object-focused. It thinks about its body. It thinks about where it's going to go in the environment. It starts to think about, how much time do I have to get there? It becomes obsessed about the body, the environment, and time. We do the same exact thing when we live by those limited emotions. We become wrapped up in our bodies and about our things in our environment and people and places and all the stuff that represents the external world, all the knowns. We focus on the knowns. And as we do that, and we endorse, by consciousness endorses the reality of the body, the environment, and time. And the brainwaves move into an emergency mode, and when that happens now, we are separate from the field, because survival has nothing to do with long-term future projects. It has everything to do with taking care of itself. And those chemicals that are created are very addictive, because it gives the brain a wake-up call, and it gives the body a rush of energy. And people begin to become addicted to those chemicals because they don't know that they're using the people in their life or the problems in their life to reinforce that emotional addiction. Did you hear me? So then they keep the person in their life or the situation in their life, even though it doesn't work, it just reinforces the emotion that they can use to remember who they think they are as a somebody. Am I still making sense? Come on, don't escape on me here. Yes? So as you begin to go into the subconscious now, and you begin to get past the analytical mind who's busy evaluating and judging and planning its future and predicting an outcome and getting ready for and expecting a particular known to happen, as we begin to get beyond that analytical mind and we begin to open our focus to the space around us, by the mere fact that you're moving your awareness outside of this limited box in your brain to beginning to become aware of the space around you, the brain actually moves into a different frequency. The brain waves begin to become very coherent. They become very orderly. They become very synchronized. And when the brain does that, it begins to recalibrate order. So when you're living in stress, the major thing that happens to the brain is it begins to compartmentalize, which means certain parts of the brain are no longer talking to other parts. And that's why everybody seems like they have a multiple personality disorder. Because in some level or another, we're using different facets of our personality to cope with different situations in our life. But when you move into that orderliness, that phase synchronized pattern, where you're becoming aware of the space, you begin to open your focus, and the brain begins to communicate with different areas, and it starts to experience more of a wholeness or more of a union. Does that make sense? And so people, when they begin to do the process, the first couple times they do it, a lot of times they say they disappeared. They forgot, they completely went away. That's because they became something other than their body. And their brain moved right into that phase synchronized pattern. And when it does that, it begins to reorganize itself in a very dramatic way. And if the brain and central nervous system communicate with every other single system in your body, your heart rate, your immune system, your circulatory system, your reproductive system, the moment you start to have a coherent signal traveling from the brain to the body, it's going to send a very coherent signal to the immune system, which is going to cause it to get very coherent orders instead of incoherent orders or disintegrated orders that are a result of the chemicals of stress. It's going to begin to send a coherent signal to the reproductive system, to the cardiovascular system, to the digestive system, and the body begins to reorganize itself into balance. Does that make sense? So as we begin to do the process and we begin to get beyond the analytical mind, one of the ways you know you're beyond the analytical mind is because you're not thinking about anything. That's how you know you're there. Okay? Now, so beta is your normal thinking in your normal day. You're listening to me, most of you, in beta. And if you close your eyes and you eliminate the external world and the brain is no longer trying to create coherence between the outer world and the inner world, you move into a phase called alpha. That's that imaginary state where brain waves go from beta to a slower brainwave pattern. Now that alpha pattern is, you go into alpha naturally every few minutes. Do you know that? Like you're sitting here right now, and as I'm explaining things to you and you're listening and you're analyzing what I'm saying and you're weighing it with what you know and you're weighing it with the temperature in the room and when we're going to get a break and all that stuff. As you're doing all of that, every now and then I say something that captures your attention, and the moment it captures your attention, I watch you. You kind of stop and you create an image and you create a visual and you're building a model. And as you create that image and you build that model, your brain goes right into alpha. And it freezes the picture so it can be entrapped or patterned in your neural architecture. And that's how we learn. You ever notice that kids that are in high beta have attention deficit disorder? They can't pause for a moment to move into alpha, so the information is never encoded. Does that make sense? Now, if you can practice this process and allow your body to begin to fall asleep while your mind stays awake, you'll move into theta. And when you move into the state, if the body has become the mind because we've conditioned it to be that way emotionally, and the body goes to sleep, it's no longer the mind. Would you agree? There's no longer any resistance from the body. And this is where spontaneous healings take place, right in theta. Because the body is finally liberated from the same emotional pattern, same energetic pattern. And then every now and then you fall into delta and you miss the door. And you wake up and you're drooling all over yourself and you don't know what happened. Oh dear. So beta and alpha represent the conscious mind. Alpha, theta, and delta represent the subconscious mind. Now remember I said in the beginning workshop that I wake up in the morning and I ask myself, what's the greatest ideal of myself that I can be? It's the first question I ask myself, and I don't get up until I move into that state, because my day is very different when I drink from the well, and I do that than when I get up and just remember myself as the old self, because I'm basically, as the old self, running off a set of memorized programs automatically. Yes? So people say, well, how long does it take you to do that? And I always say, I always allow 2 hours in the morning. People go, 2 hours? It's a lot of time. Well, do you know, some days it takes me just an hour to relax enough to be in the present moment. Why? Because I got to catch a plane, I got to meet with my staff, I got to do these different things, I got 1,000 things going on, I got to check these emails and look at these files and da-da-da. And when I get up, that's the first thing my body wants to do. It's been conditioned to do what it knows how to do really well. And because there's an addictive chemical connection to that, my body already, listen to this, I know it's already in the day and it's 10:30 because I'm running through that. And when my body starts to do that, I always say the same thing. Oh, now. You know how to do all of that stuff, and you're going to get it all done, so stop it. Let's just work on the moment here now. Now, my 2 hours, sometimes the first portion of that, I allow for 2 hours. It doesn't necessarily mean I take 2 hours, but I allow for 2 hours, because if I don't allow for 2 hours, what is my ego going to say? Dude, you don't have enough time to do this. If it's not 2 hours, I'm going to talk myself out of it, because, it's not enough time. So the first portion of my meditation is moving into the moment, because my body immediately wants to rush to the future. It immediately wants to think about what happened yesterday. And it wants to then look at what happened yesterday, embrace it from an emotional standpoint, and then prepare what it's going to do in the future, that next, in the rest of the future day. So I'm basically living out of the moment when I do that. Now here's how I know that I'm out of the moment, because my body literally feels like it wants to race to the future, like it's a horse, like an animal that you're trying to train, and you tell it to sit and it gets up. Do you know what I'm talking about? Now, you won't know this unless you come up against it. And that's what we're going to do after the break. We're going to work on you moving into the present moment. We're going to work on a little meditation where you're going to sit there, and I'm going to ask you to focus on a single-minded thing. And the moment you start to notice that your brain starts thinking about lunch or dinner this evening, or what's going to happen at 4 o'clock tomorrow, what you're going to do on Tuesday with your friend, the moment you begin to fantasize or project your mind into the future, your body's going to begin to move into the future moment, which means now you're lined up to that time. That's how we can ensure survival. But I'm going to ask you, the moment that it does that and your body starts to rush to the future moment, you're going to bring it back to the present moment. You're going to take a breath and you're going to relax it like a horse. You're going to pull those reins in. You're going to stroke it on the side. You're going to settle it down into the present moment. And when it begins to move into the present moment, you're going to relax it and you're going to keep conditioning it to the present moment. Then it's going to think, an emotion's going to come up of frustration or boredom or whatever, and you're going to realize that that emotion is connected to a past experience, and your body literally is moving back to the past. And the moment you become metacognitive and aware that you're in the past, you're going to bring yourself back to the present moment again and relax your body in the present moment. So attention is a skill, just like golf or tennis. And the more you practice it, the better you become at it. And so if you're wondering in your meditation why things aren't changing at the way you anticipate them to change. This is one of the reasons. And so people say to me, what do you do? Tell me what you do. And we're going to do exactly what I do in the first 45 minutes of my meditation until I can settle that body down where it's comfortable in the moment. Now, how many people here have ever trained a horse? You ever trained a dog? I'm not going to ask if you try to train a cat, so forget that. But I have a stallion that I ride, and I don't ride him too often, but when I do ride him, he's just a big, proud boy, you know? And when he smells the mares up in the pasture on the other side of the property, he's got a whole different agenda, especially if I haven't ridden him in a long time. And so the moment he starts to, snort and breathe and back up, you know what he's saying, right? He wants to be in control. Do you know what I mean? And I don't do anything except I stop him in his tracks, and I pull those reins in just a little bit, and I stroke him on the side, and I bring him into the present moment. And he settles down. And we go a little bit, and all of a sudden, he starts thinking about what? The girls, right? You can't blame him. And then I pull him back in and I bring him into the present moment. And if I do that enough times, he surrenders. And he surrenders to me as his mind. And we're one now. And we can walk around that arena and I can get him doing exactly what I want him to do. But in the beginning, he wants to do what he wants to do. Now, your body is the servant to your mind. But if we condition the body emotionally by our unconscious thoughts and feelings, the body literally becomes the mind. The servant becomes the master. The animal now has a different agenda. It's been trained to be a certain way. And so then the moment you start to condition your body into a new mind or move into the present moment, there's a good possibility that it's going to want to rebel, just like my stallion. And it's stubborn. And it wants to be in control. So it may create pain in your head. It may make you want to get up and go to the bathroom. It may make you want to open your eyes and look around the room. It may want to make you feel frustrated. It may want to doubt that you could do this. It may want to do all of that stuff. Why is it doing that? Because the moment you quit, who's back in control? Now, what is self-love? Is when you sit, self-love is not about getting a manicure or a facelift or buying yourself new clothes or a sports car. It's not self-love. That's pleasure. That's very hedonic, understanding of reality. Self-love is when you sit there and your body starts to send feedback back to the brain saying, you can't do this, you're too much like your mother, you'll never change, all of that stuff. It's doing that because those are old circuits in our brain that we fired and wired that go by unnoticed in our waking day because we're too distracted by everything in our life. They're still processing that, but you're not noticing it, so it's going right into the subconscious, right beyond the analytical mind, right down the central nervous system, down those gates that are already open because the highway has been connected to the body. Are you still with me? So the moment you close your eyes and all of a sudden all of this comes up, that is who you really are when you're not distracted by your world or when you're about ready to make a decision to become somebody else. And all of a sudden fear comes up or doubt or whatever comes up. That's always been there. And that fear or doubt has caused you to analyze yourself within the emotion so that you don't have to change. So metacognition, the ability to observe who we are, who we're being, becomes analysis when people are trying to change within the emotion that they memorized. And when they're stuck in that emotion, all they can do is they could only analyze self within that emotion. You break out of that emotion and you're freed from the emotion, you can look back at the self emotionally and no longer want to be that individual. Does that make sense? So, self-love is born when you say, we're going to sit here and we're going to keep moving into the present moment until you're going to acquiesce to my mind. And you would say, oh my God, that's really hard. Until you break through and there's a rush of energy in your body, the hair on the back of your neck stands up, and your body begins to respond, and you're free from that emotion, and it's in the present, and in the rest of your day, you're present with everybody, and you're in love with life, and you begin to feel like respect for yourself because you said to the body, oh man, I've been a really poor master. I've been endorsing fear on a cellular level every day. And so when I bring you to the present moment, you're afraid what the next moment's going to be. You're already trying to anticipate it. No. We're just going to be in the present moment. We're going to just do this until you begin to relax into the moment. And the moment you're able to do that and you start to relax into the moment and the body surrenders, guess what? Now you're in the creative state. What do you want? Now, what do you want your body to think it's in emotionally? Because that's what we're going to do after that. We're going to condition your body to begin to think that it's in experiences ahead of the experiences with emotions that we want to cultivate for ourselves. But we can't do that until you can move into the present moment. Does that make sense? So, we're going to break here in a minute. After we break, you're going to come back and we're going to do a little process. And I'm going to ask you to stay in the present moment. That's what I want you to focus on. And when you start to anticipate lunch or a pain in your foot or you should scratch your ear or what your body's trying to do to keep you out of its orderliness, you have to bring it back to the present moment and be in control over it. And as you settle it down, you're not going to die if you don't move. You're not gonna have a seizure. None of that's gonna happen. But your body's gonna tell you the worst case scenario. Why? Because the moment you respond to that voice as if it's true, remember, just because you have a thought doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It's just old circuits that you fired and wired. When you stop that voice and you begin to realize that it's signals coming from your body to your brain because you're depriving it of the anticipation of the future or the reflection of the past. You're depriving it of those bouncing back and forths, and you're putting it into the present moment. Your body's going to want to buck and kick. But if you keep doing it, it will begin to follow the mind. And when you're able to do that, you become more present. And your chemistry changes, and you feel more in control and more relaxed. And you don't have to worry about the next moment because you've created the next moment.